The snow in Godric's Hollow was falling the way it only falls in the very small hours of Christmas morning, without urgency, without wind, settling onto every surface with the patient thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world. Harry walked beside Hermione through the narrow lane that led toward the churchyard, and the village was so quiet that he could hear the flakes landing. Cottages sat dark behind their windows. A war memorial rose from the square. He had glanced at it on the way through and not stopped, because it had shown him what he wasn't ready to see, and the cobblestones beneath the snow were uneven and old, worn by centuries of ordinary feet. The kind of village where his parents had lived. He had been in many places that frightened him, but they had mostly frightened him in ways he understood. Fast, urgent, unambiguous. This was different. This was the slow fear, the kind that comes in with the cold and settles. He put one foot in front of the other and tried not to think too precisely about who was buried here. Hermione moved a few steps to his left, her wand held low, a pale sphere of light pooling at its tip, just wide enough to read inscriptions by. He watched the glow travel across names and dates and names and dates, generation after generation of people who had once had problems, and the silence between them had nothing unfriendly in it. There was just nothing adequate to say. He found them in the far corner of the churchyard, beneath a stone angel that the weather had softened into anonymity. James Potter and Lily Potter, their names carved side by side, the dates. He had known the dates for years, had done the arithmetic without meaning to, in quiet moments when his mind ran ahead of him, but knowing and reading are different things. Reading it here, in real stone, made the arithmetic heavier. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. He stood there and let it be a real thing, rather than an idea. The snow went on falling, he thought. 21, both of them, 21 years old, 4 years older than he was right now. He was 17 and standing in a graveyard on Christmas Eve, with Voldemort's soul attached to him like a passenger, and his parents had been 21. He held that for a moment and then released it, because there was nothing to be done with it. Hermione came up beside him without asking whether he wanted company. She raised her wand, and from nothing a wreath of white flowers appeared, small and wild-looking, like something cut from a garden gone to seed, and she placed it at the base of the stone with a precision that was also something else. She stepped back and stood quietly beside him, her shoulder just barely against his, and he stayed still and let the cold do what it was going to do. Neither of them spoke. Time passed the way it does in graveyard, which is to say it didn't seem to pass at all. She moved first, drifting toward the older section of the churchyard, where the stones were taller and the inscriptions more elaborate. Harry gave himself another minute. He thought about saying something and found he had nothing that wasn't inadequate. He turned and followed her. She had stopped 10 feet away, the wand held steady at shoulder height, her head tilted. "Harry," she said quietly, "come and look at this." The gravestone she had found was older than the ones around it. The stone, a darker grey, the lettering cut deeper than sentiment, with the preserved gravity of an earlier century, formal and permanent. Ignotus Peverell. Beneath the name, cut into the stone with a precision that could only have been intentional. A circle inside a triangle, bisected from top to bottom by a straight vertical line. Harry recognized it immediately. He had seen it drawn in Dumbledore's own hand in the copy of The Tales of Beedle the Bard left to Hermione. He had seen it worn as a pendant at the wedding. He hadn't understood what it meant then. He couldn't quite hold what it meant, that the name beneath it was his ancestor's name. "He's been here the whole time," Hermione said. Her voice was quiet and oddly careful. "In your family's village." Harry crouched to read the inscription at the stone's base, but the weather had been working on it for centuries, and it was worn past reading. He reached to brush the snow from the lower edge, and his fingers closed around something that wasn't stone. Wedged into the gap between the stone's base and the frozen earth. Pressed so far in that it had become part of the landscape, buried under lichen and a hard skin of compacted ice, was a slim volume. He worked it free, carefully, frowning down at it. Dark leather cover, no bigger than a pocket journal. Pressed into the leather, in black wax, was the same symbol as the headstone. Triangle, circle, line. Hermione crouched beside him without a word. She took it from his hands and turned it in the wandlight, her expression moving through curiosity and into something more deliberate. "The spine," she said, half to herself. "This script, it's archaic, wizarding Latin. There are rune forms worked into the letterwork that I've only encountered in advanced texts, examination-level analysis." She turned it again, slowly. "This is genuinely old, Harry." "Pre-statute of secrecy old? Can you open it?" She tried. Her fingers pressed the wax seal, and nothing moved. The seal held against her as completely as if it had never been meant to yield to fingers at all, as if it were waiting for something more specific than hands. She handed it back with a look that meant, "I don't know what it wants." Harry turned it over. Then he could not have said afterward whether it was carelessness or something else, entirely. He held it out between them so they could both see the cover, and Hermione reached for the far edge with 2 fingers at the same moment his left hand settled across the spine. The wax seal dissolved, not cracked or broke, dissolved silently, the way a word disappears when you stop saying it, leaving no residue, no gap. The book fell open in Harry's hands to a page near the middle, and the text on that page had apparently been waiting there all along, invisible until this precise arrangement, both of them, both hands, both at once. His name was at the top of the entry, a hand so fine and formal it looked engraved Henry James Potter, heir to the line of Ignotus. He read it twice. Then his eyes moved down the page. Hermione Jean Granger, heir to the line of Antioch. Hermione had gone very still. The snow fell. The village offered nothing. Then the warmth came. It started in his left hand where it rested on the spine and moved up his arm at a pace that was almost unhurried, steady, and it was not painful. He had expected pain, or at least something with edges, something that reflected the seriousness of what he was holding, but it was warm only, and intimate in a way that had no business existing in a December churchyard at midnight. Hermione's fingers had tightened slightly on the edge of the cover. The Deathly Hallows symbol on the front blazed gold for a single breath, precise, silent, complete, and then it was just leather again, just cold air and old paper. Harry looked at Hermione across the book. She looked back. Her expression was the one she got when a calculation had just produced a result she hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet whether to trust. Neither of them said anything. Movement at the gate, a figure, small, elderly, entirely still, standing where the lane met the churchyard entrance, where no one had been a moment before. She raised one hand and beckoned, and Harry's scar burned, and he understood what the burning meant the way you understand something you've always known but hoped you were wrong about. He shoved the book into Hermione's beaded bag. She took it without a word. The next several minutes were the kind he could never reconstruct in order, the figure and the house, the dark room with its wrong smell, the moment the face the figure wore stopped wearing it. The bite and the sharp crack of something snapping in two, and Hermione's voice very close in the dark, saying his name, and then the cold night air and the pull of her arm around him, and the world broke apart and reassembled itself somewhere completely different. They landed hard on frozen ground in the dark somewhere in Britain. Harry lay still and breathed. In his right fist were 2 pieces of wood, the break clean, the core cold. He looked at them for a long moment. His wand, the one he had carried since the age of 11, broken. Hermione was on her hands and knees beside him, catching her breath. The beaded bag sat between them on the frozen ground. Somewhere inside it, beneath everything else she carried, the small, dark ledger lay, with its seal dissolved and its impossible names waiting. In the center of Harry's chest, there was a feeling he had no word for. Not the warmth that had faded, something quieter than warmth. The particular stillness that follows a sound you didn't know you'd been listening for. Christmas morning arrived grey and unremarkable, the tent walls pale with diffuse light from a sky that had been overcast since before Harry woke. He lay still for a few seconds after his eyes opened, listening to the silence of the Horcrux hunt in winter, which had its own specific quality. No birdsong, no voices, just the faint hiss of protective enchantments and the sound of wind over dead grass somewhere outside. He remembered what was in the bag on the other side of the tent. Hermione was already at the small folding table, her back to him, the lamp lit, the ledger open in front of her. She had been at it for hours at least. There was a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, and a page of transcription that had been filled and turned and filled again. She was copying script from the ledger in one column, and writing English glosses in another, working through it the way she worked through everything methodically, without rushing, as if the problem was simply a question of sufficient attention. Ron's cot was occupied, his red hair visible above the blanket, his breathing the slow, steady rhythm of someone with no intention of waking. His ribs ached from last night, a deep bruise across his left side, where he'd been thrown against something he couldn't remember clearly, and when he crossed to the small stove and filled the kettle, he did it carefully. His wand was in his jacket pocket. Both pieces of it, he had reached for them in the dark 3 times before he slept, and each time it had been the same, half a wand, clean break, core cold. He noticed, while he waited for the water to boil, that he was aware of where Hermione was. Not in the ordinary way of knowing someone was in the room. In the way of knowing precisely, 2 feet to his right, and behind him, bent over the table, quill moving. He could have drawn it without looking. He had never tracked anyone's location with that kind of precision before, and the noticing of it, the fact that he was doing it without deciding to, sat uncomfortably between his shoulder blades. The dough was still with him too. Silver and gentle in the dark behind his eyes, someone had known where he was. Someone had sent a Patronus shaped like a dough, which was a specific and deliberate shape, and led him to the sword in the frozen pool. They had done it without announcing themselves, without asking for anything. It was the act of a person who cared for someone who couldn't know it. He thought about the cost of that, caring for someone who couldn't know, and found he was still thinking about it when the kettle began to sound. He made 2 cups and set one beside Hermione. She looked up. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, and her hands, when she reached for the cup, were still faintly trembling. Residual spellwork strain from hours of disapparating, shielding, fighting her way back from whatever the night had done to her. She said, "Thank you," quietly, and he sat down across from her. "How far have you got?" "Far enough." She turned one of the transcription pages toward him. The title, as closely as I can render it, is Registry of the Peverell Compact, Betrothal Bindings of the 3 Lines. It's a record of betrothals contracted through the Peverell bloodlines going back several centuries. Most of the entries are completed. There are names, dates, confirmation markings. She paused. Only 2 entries are unfinished. Which ones? She looked at him steadily. Ours. Harry read the transcription. Hermione talked him through the sections she had managed to render into English, and where the archaic Latin resisted her, she described the rune forms and what analogous forms she had encountered in advanced study texts, drawing careful conclusions from the edges of things. The mechanism, as she had worked it out, the ledger held the bloodlines. It tracked them across generations, waiting. Not everyone descended from the 3 Peverell brothers was recorded. Only those in whom the specific inheritance ran strongest. But the ledger knew when such a person was born, and it noted them, and it waited for the circumstance it had been designed to find. A son of Ignatius's line and a daughter of Antioch's line alive at the same time, touching the cover simultaneously. When that happened, the seal activated. Not by anyone's choice. There was a long quiet after she finished explaining it. The problem, Hermione said, setting down her quill, is that I'm Muggle-born. She said it the way she said things she had already examined from every angle, flatly and without self-pity, as a statement of fact that was also a problem to be solved. Her parents were dentists. She had no wizarding family, no tradition, no ancestral connection to anything that predated the year they had taken her to Diagon Alley for her school things. She had no Peverell blood. She could not have. But the seal activated, Harry said. But the seal activated. She turned her quill over in her fingers twice and set it down. So either the ledger is wrong, and it's ancient magic that has functioned correctly for centuries, which makes that unlikely, or I have Peverell ancestry that simply isn't in any record I can access. That I don't know about. That went underground so long ago it became invisible. Is that possible? It's how Muggle-borns exist. She said it simply, matter-of-factly. The accepted explanation is that magic resurfaces after going dormant across generations. A wizard's child who didn't inherit magic would be a squib, and a squib's children would be muggles. But the magical inheritance doesn't disappear. It waits, and eventually it comes back. It would look, from the outside, like a muggle family suddenly producing a witch from nowhere. That's the explanation for every muggle born there's ever been. A pause. If the ledger found my name, the blood is there. I just don't know whose it is. Ron woke at 9:30, sat up, looked at the 2 of them, and said, "What's wrong?" Hermione told him they had found a Peverell artifact in the churchyard, a betrothal register, and that it had activated when she and Harry touched it. Ron listened with his arms on his knees, and his expression very attentive, his blue eyes moving between them in the careful way that meant he was taking in considerably more than he was acknowledging. When she finished, he said, "A betrothal register." Not a question, but with a particular inflection that meant he was doing the same thing she had just done, turning it over from every angle before deciding what it meant. "It's very old magic," Hermione said. "We're still working out the mechanics." "Right," Ron said. He got up and found his boots, and began putting them on with the focused efficiency of someone deciding not to say something yet. Harry noticed, and filed it. Later in the afternoon, while Ron was outside tending the fire, Harry came and stood beside Hermione at the table. "Do you feel different?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she gave everything its proper weight. "A little warmer than usual," she said eventually. "And I keep noticing where you are in the tent. I catch myself knowing, not guessing." She looked at the transcription page, not at him. "You've been doing it too since last night," Harry said. They stood there for a moment. Outside, the fire crackled. Neither of them named what it might mean because there was nothing to name yet, and naming it would mean acknowledging what had happened, and what had happened was already large enough to stand in the tent with them without being given a word. It was in the late afternoon that Hermione found the mechanism section. She went very quiet when she translated it, and read it twice before she said anything. The seal, once activated, could not be dissolved by either party's will alone. It had two possible outcomes. The first, the bound parties chose each other freely and explicitly, at which point the binding transformed became something other than a constraint. The second, it was broken by external means, which was possible but carried proportional damage to both parties. 30 days from activation, which was today, it could be broken with moderate harm. At 60 days it was barely breakable and the harm was serious. Beyond 60 days it was, for practical purposes, permanent, unless the first outcome was achieved. 30 days is the 23rd of January, Hermione said. Her voice was level. 60 days is the 22nd of February. Harry worked out the gap between those dates and today, and then worked out what would happen if the Horcrux hunt took longer than 60 days, which it had already been doing for months before they had even reached the churchyard. The numbers sat in the tent without resolution, and outside the fire went on burning, and Ron came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, and none of them said anything else about it for the rest of the evening. The lamp burned low through the small hours, and Hermione worked. The obscured passage had resisted her for most of Christmas Day. The rune forms were compressed, the Latin stacked with abbreviations she had to cross-reference against everything she had ever memorized from advanced texts, and the damage to the entry was not the ordinary damage of age, but something deliberate. As though the letters had been worn away by a very specific intention to make them unreadable. She could get the shape of some words and not others. She kept at it. By 2 in the morning, she had a partial rendering, and by 4, she had something she was willing to trust. Heir to the line of Antioch, she read it 4 times, then she sat back and looked at the lamp and thought for a long time. Antioch Peverell, the eldest of the 3 brothers, possessor of the Elder Wand. According to the legend in the tales, the book open on the table to the relevant page, the one that Dumbledore had left to her, specifically to her, he had been murdered in his sleep the night after winning his first duel with it, having boasted of its power, a short and violent life. No mention of children, no mention of anyone who came after him. The historical record stopped at his death, the way records did when no one thought to ask what was left behind. The argument took shape like an essay, as she wrote it. Antioch's murder had been sudden, and no one had thought to make an inventory of his household afterward. The Peverell family had a tradition of secrecy extending across generations. Harry's family had kept the cloak hidden for centuries before Dumbledore even found out about it, and that was the cautious Ignotus line. Antioch's line might have gone underground by design, by a child who knew what had happened to their father and understood that carrying the Peverell name meant being a target, a child who became a squib, whose children were muggles, whose descendants' magical inheritance lay dormant across hundreds of years until it surfaced again in a girl born in Oxford in 1979 who had never heard the name Peverell until she was reading about it for an examination. The ledger didn't create what wasn't there, it found what was. She was still at the table when Harry woke. He read the Beadle the Bard while she slept for 2 hours on the narrow cot, and he read it carefully, the way he read things when they mattered. The tale of the 3 brothers, Antioch, who had demanded a wand more powerful than any other, Cadmus, who had wanted to recall the dead, Ignotus, who had asked only to pass through the world unseen, which was the wish Harry understood most viscerally, and always had. The tale ended where it always ended. Antioch dead, Cadmus destroyed by what he'd asked for, Ignotus living to a great age and greeting death as a friend. No children mentioned for any of them in the story. But the story was a legend, and legends were not inventories. When Hermione woke, he had tea made and a theory half formed. The Potters kept the cloak secret for centuries, he said when she sat down. She looked at him, sleep still in the corners of her eyes. You're saying Antioch kept a child's secret. I'm saying maybe the ledger knew what the history books didn't. She considered this for a long moment, then reached for her notes. Ron had been quiet through most of this, which was not unusual for Ron in the mornings. He had listened to enough of the broad outline by now to understand the shape of it. A magical artifact. Peverell bloodlines. Something that had activated, but the specifics were still something Harry and Hermione had kept careful about. The ledger itself was usually in Hermione's bag. On the afternoon of the 27th, though, Harry had left it on the table. Ron picked it up. His large hands turned at once, studying the symbol on the cover. Nothing happened, no warmth, no response, no recognition. The cover stayed dark and ordinary under his fingers. He frowned at this for a moment and then opened it. He read slowly. Harry watched him from across the tent and did not move or speak because there was nothing to say in the time it took Ron's eyes to find the page, to read the first entry, to find the second. It was quiet and private, the expression of someone who has just understood something they had suspected and hoped they were wrong about. He closed the ledger and set it on the table. "Is this what I think it is?" he said, looking at Harry. "Yes, you're betrothed to her. The magic sealed it before we knew what it was." Harry kept his voice level. "Neither of us chose it. We touched the cover and it activated, and by the time we understood what had happened..." Ron nodded. He picked up his own cup of tea, which had gone cold, and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it down. "Right," he said, and went back to what he had been doing before, which was mending a hole in his jacket with a needle and thread. He did not leave. He did not explode or shout or make the fight that Harry had been half braced for since he saw Ron's face go quiet over the ledger. He had already left once in early autumn under the weight of the locket and everything the locket had made him believe. Harry knew it, and Ron knew. Harry knew it, and that knowledge sat between them like something they had both agreed not to pick up again. He didn't leave. But he started calling Hermione Hermione instead of Hermione, which was the same word but in a different register, careful and measured where it had been easy. And he called Harry mate in a tone that had a specific quality to it. The quality of someone who had made a decision to be decent about something they weren't required to be decent about and were going to hold to it regardless. That night, Harry lay awake and thought about Ginny. He did this without permission, without the thought announcing itself first. He was looking at the canvas ceiling of the tent, and then he was thinking about the last time he had seen her, the particular way she stood, the directness of her eyes. They were brown, he remembered, and she had red hair and a presence that was her own, something sharp and warm that he had been aware of since 6th year and had chosen to put away from him because protecting her had required distance, and he had made that choice deliberately and in full knowledge of the cost. He still loved her, or the idea of her. What she represented, the normal future that waited on the other side of all this, the one where he had survived, and there was no Horcrux left in him, and he was just Harry, in a kitchen somewhere, not responsible for anyone's life. He held that image for a while, and then he noticed, without deciding to, that he was aware of where Hermione was sleeping, 3 feet to his left, the particular cadence of her breathing, with the same involuntary precision he had been trying not to examine since Christmas Eve. The two things sat beside each other and did not resolve. He did not make them. The pull came on the second night after Christmas, when Hermione stepped outside to refresh the protective enchantments on the tent. It was not violent. It was not alarming, in the way that pain was alarming. It was directional, a tension in the center of his chest that oriented itself toward the door of the tent and stretched, not painfully, but insistently, the way a compass needle feels when you turn it away from north. He sat up. Through the canvas he could hear her footsteps on the frozen ground, moving in the slow, deliberate circuit she always made when she was laying the spells, and the tension shifted to track her, precise and unavoidable, a thread pulled taut between her position and somewhere inside his sternum. Then her footsteps came back. The tent flap opened. She stepped inside, and the tension eased all at once, so completely that the absence of it was almost as noticeable as the presence had been. She looked at him, sitting up, and then at her own hand, which she had pressed flat to her chest at some point, without seeming to notice. Harry said, quietly. It started. She sat down on her cot and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then she reached for the ledger, because that was how she handled things she didn't have words for yet, and she opened it, and she read. January was the hardest part of winter, and the tent had become a particular kind of small. Hermione had divided the table into two territories that overlapped at the center, the ledger on one side, Horcrux notes on the other, and in the middle a growing chaos of transcribed passages, cross-references, and a particular kind of exhausted handwriting. The Horcrux hunt was stalled. They had no lead on what came next, no new information since before Christmas, and the absence of forward motion had settled over the tent-like weather. They moved carefully around one another. They kept the fire going. They talked about practical things. In between the practical things, Hermione kept building the argument. She had started writing it down, not because she needed the notes, but because writing made it real, made it a thing she could examine rather than a thing she had to carry. The case for her Antioch connection, set out methodically. Antioch's murder was well documented, but the aftermath was not. There had been no inventory made of his household, no accounting for dependents, no record of who, if anyone, had been left behind. People in the Legends era did not tend to ask those questions. They wrote down that the powerful man had died and moved on to what came next. The Peverell secrecy tradition was old, older than the Potter's keeping of the cloak, and that had lasted centuries, and Antioch's child would have had very good reason to know that their father's name made them a target to disappear, to become, across enough generations, simply a Muggle family, in whom something dormant stirred. Eventually, in a girl who grew up to have no explanation for herself, except that she had always been this way, always known that magic was real, always felt it waiting in her hands like a held breath. The ledger's magic did not lie, it responded to blood, not to biography. Whatever her biography said, the blood was there. She looked at Harry across the table. He was reading the Beadle the Bard, the copy Dumbledore had left to her, and he had the expression he got when he was thinking several things at once and not saying any of them. Harry had been on the Antioch problem for 2 days before the question he hadn't meant to arrive at arrived anyway. Dumbledore had drawn the Deathly Hallows symbol in his own copy of the book, the same symbol that was on the ledger cover, the same symbol on Ignotus Peverell's gravestone, the same copy he had left to Hermione, not to Harry, not to Ron, to Hermione specifically, along with a book about runes and a first edition in which the marginalia suggested someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the three brothers and what connected them. Harry had been told, eventually, about the Hallows and the Peverells. He had pieced it together in fragments. But Dumbledore had put the pieces in Hermione's hands specifically, and left her the tools for someone who would need to do very precise linguistic and magical analysis, he thought. Did Dumbledore know? He held the question at arm's length. There was no evidence for it. There was nothing beyond the fact that Dumbledore had been Dumbledore, which historically had meant knowing a great deal more than he ever explained to anyone, and that the book had gone to Hermione. It could have been coincidence. It could have been that Dumbledore had simply thought she was the one who would use it best. Harry had no way of knowing, and the thing about Dumbledore's posthumous plans was that they always turned out to be more intricate than anyone could have predicted, and always more at Harry's expense, and he was not sure he wanted to examine this one too closely. He closed the book and looked at Hermione's notes. "I found something else," she said, from across the table, without looking up from the ledger. She had been in the same posture for 20 minutes, very still, pen not moving. When Hermione stopped moving her pen, she was either stuck or had arrived somewhere significant. She read it aloud, haltingly, constructing the English as she went. The compact does not create what is not already present. It recognizes, where two heirs would choose, rightly the compact, names them before they know to choose. The silence that followed had a particular quality. It's saying it didn't manufacture us, Harry said. She did look at him now, briefly. Then away. Something the magic identified as already true, not arbitrarily selected bloodlines. A genuine resonance. She used the word as if it were a technical term she didn't entirely endorse. Between the specific people, Harry said after a moment, what do you feel? About the betrothal. Not what you think about it, what you feel. She put down her pen. It's outrageous, she said. It removes consent entirely. It's an ancient institution built on assumptions about property and lineage that have no place in how we actually live. It made a decision about us without our knowledge, and the fact that it claims to have done so for good reasons doesn't. She stopped. 3 seconds of silence. Also sort of, Harry said carefully. Hermione stared at him. Neither of them said anything further, because neither of them had to. The tent flap opened. Ron had been outside refilling the water, which took approximately 4 minutes, and he came back, in the way he always came back, ducking his head at the entrance, straightening, reaching to shake the snow from his coat. He stopped halfway through the motion. Harry and Hermione had not moved. The air in the tent was the specific air of a sentence that had just been finished. Ron looked at them for exactly 1 second. Then he turned around and walked back out. He stood in the snow for a very long time. Harry could see his shape through the canvas, tall and still, facing away from the tent. Not pacing, not leaving. Just standing in the January cold, doing whatever it was Ron did when the world presented him with something he had known was coming and had not managed to fully prepare for. It was not anger that kept him there. Harry knew what Ron's anger looked like, and this wasn't it. Hermione had gone to stand at the canvas wall, her arms around herself, watching Ron's outline. She did not go to him. Harry did not go to him either. After a while they both sat back down, and the ledger sat open between them, and the three of them occupied the same situation from their different angles. Ron came back in after an hour and a quarter. He said, "I'm making soup." And he made soup, carefully, and without asking for help, and they ate it, and no one mentioned anything. This was, Harry thought, one of the more precise demonstrations of character he had ever witnessed. That night, Hermione fell asleep at the table. It was past midnight. She had been translating through the evening in the focused way that meant she had lost track of time completely, and her head came down onto her folded arms without ceremony, the pen still in her hand. Harry heard the change in her breathing from across the tent. He got up. He took his jacket from the back of the chair he'd been sitting on and crossed to the table and laid it across her shoulders carefully, not touching her, not making any sound that might wake her. She didn't stir. He stood there for a moment in the lamplight, looking at the top of her head, the loose curls of her hair where it had escaped from whatever she'd tied it back with. There was a warmth in his chest, steady and low. He had been trying for weeks now to distinguish between the warmth that was the seal and the warmth that was something else, and he had gradually come to understand that this was not a distinction the seal respected, or possibly a distinction that had ever existed in the form he needed it to. He didn't know how to tell the difference anymore. He was no longer sure the difference was the right question. He went back to his cot in the dark and lay down and listened to the quiet, and in the morning no one said anything about any of it, and the hunt went on. The tent had a rhythm to it now, which was either adaptation or surrender, and Ron had stopped trying to tell the difference. He and Harry had found their way back to something recognizable: chess in the evenings, brief, terrible jokes about their situation, the specific comfort of being around someone who did not require explanation. Weeks had built a kind of scar tissue over the worst of January, not healing it exactly, just covering it over well enough to function. Ron had found that if he kept himself occupied and did not examine things too carefully, the occupied feeling was enough to get through a day. He watched Harry and Hermione the way he watched chess problems, looking for the underlying logic, not the surface movement. What he saw was this: Harry had stopped pretending he didn't know where Hermione was. He had stopped pretending it was not a constant, low-level awareness, the way a background noise became noticeable only when it stopped. He tracked her without appearing to, his eyes finding her automatically when she moved, his attention orienting toward wherever in the tent she happened to be. Hermione, for her part, had started doing a thing with her pen, tapping it once against the table whenever she finished a thought, and then glancing up, not at the text, at whatever part of the room Harry was in, before going back to work. She did not appear to notice she was doing it. Ron noticed. He filed it, and he said nothing. And he kept moving. It was a cold morning in late February when Hermione slipped on the ice. She had gone out to check the protective enchantments, the usual circuit she made every morning, slow and deliberate, laying the spells at the compass points, and Ron was watching from the tent entrance, with his cup of tea when her boot went out from under her on a patch of ice that had formed overnight, grey and nearly invisible against the frozen ground. She went down hard on one knee and caught herself with her right hand, but her left palm struck a rock embedded in the ice at the edge of the slope, and Ron heard the sound of it. He was already moving when Harry, from inside the tent, made a sharp, involuntary sound. Ron looked back. Harry was on his feet with his left hand gripped in his right, staring at his own palm. The color had gone from his face. What? Ron started. Harry was already past him, out the tent door, crossing the frozen ground to Hermione in the time it took Ron to process what had happened. When he got there, Hermione was sitting up, pressing her sliced palm against her jacket. Harry arrived with his own hand already held out, already bearing a cut in the exact location of hers, not a wound, not quite, but the mark of one, vivid, against his palm. He crouched in front of her, and they looked at each other's hands, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I felt it," Harry said finally. Ron stood a few feet back and looked at this and understood it, and felt the thing he had been managing not to feel for several weeks settle into a new and permanent shape inside him. Hermione healed both their hands with a careful charm. Then the three of them went inside. She got the ledger down from the shelf and opened it to the mechanism section she had worked through in December, and she did the calculation from the archaic formula, and she told them what she found. The 60-day threshold, she said. It passed 3 days ago. She kept her voice level. Breaking the seal now, by external means, any external means would cause serious magical harm to both of us, the kind that doesn't heal cleanly. She folded her hands on the table. In approximately another month, it reaches the final threshold. After that, it is, for all practical purposes, permanent, unless the other outcome is achieved. Ron said, "What does freely fulfilled mean?" "It means they would have to choose each other," Hermione said. "Willingly and explicitly, both of them. At which point the binding transforms, stops being a constraint and becomes," she paused, "something else." Ron looked at Harry. Harry looked at the wall. He had been looking at the wall for several seconds before the thing he had been holding arrived. Not in a rush, but in the particular way of a thing that had been building for a long time, and found finally a crack. "I'm so sick of it," he said. His voice was flat. "I'm so sick of being told." Neither Ron nor Hermione spoke. "The prophecy," Harry said. "I was marked before I could walk. My parents died because of a prophecy made before I was born. I carry a piece of his soul because he decided, before I had any say, that I was the one who would destroy him. I broke things I didn't want to break, things that mattered to me. To protect people from a fate I didn't ask for." He stopped. He was looking at his own hands now, the healed left palm, the absence of the wand he'd had since he was 11. "And now there's this, and people keep telling me, the ledger says it, you said it, that what I feel is real, that it's genuine, that it's mine. And I believe you. I think I believe you, but I don't want to be told that by something that had already decided before I ever met her. I want to have chosen it. I want it to have been mine, actually mine, not something an old book found for me and named before I even knew to look." He stopped. The tent was very quiet. Hermione was still. She had the expression she got when she was making a decision about what kind of answer a question actually required, and she took her time with it, and then she spoke. "The ledger doesn't create what isn't there. It says, so itself it recognizes." Her voice was quiet, not soft, precise. "The prophecy said you had a power Voldemort doesn't understand. That didn't create the power. It noticed it. The power existed before the prophecy was made. The prophecy was a record, not an instruction." She looked at him. "This is the same. If you feel something, Harry, that's yours." The seal didn't put it there. It named something that was already present and would have been present, whether the ledger existed or not. You're angry at the naming, but the thing that got named, that was always going to be yours. Harry didn't answer. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, and the conversation ended, the way conversations ended when something true had been said that hadn't been agreed with and hadn't been rejected, either, just held. That night he lay in the dark and thought about Ginny. He did it with deliberate fairness, making himself hold the thought carefully and not flinch from it. She was real. The warmth of her, the particular sharpness of her attention, the future she stood for. A future where he had survived, where there was a life on the other side of all this, where he could be ordinary for a while. Pow. He had loved her, and the feeling had not simply disappeared. It was still there, like an ember, and the fact that it was still there felt important to acknowledge honestly. Then, without meaning to, he thought about Hermione. The shape of her concentration when she was working through something hard. The sound of her turning pages in the dark. The way the tent felt different when she stepped outside it. The way his hand had already known where she'd been hurt before he had. Both things were real. He lay there and held them both, and did not try to resolve them, because he already understood, somewhere he hadn't quite looked at directly yet, that the question he'd been asking was the wrong one. The question wasn't which was real. The question was which was true. He fell asleep without answering it, and the tent went on being small, and outside the February cold pressed against the canvas and held. Ron asked the question 2 days before they reached the house, while Harry was sitting outside the tent in the weak March sun, watching a crow work at something frozen in the grass. He came and sat down beside Harry, without preamble, and said, "Are you going to marry her?" Harry looked at the crow. "I don't know. Do you want to?" The crow found what it was looking for and flew away. Harry watched it go. He had been thinking about this question in the background of everything else for months, and had managed so far not to let it become a sentence. Ron asking it out loud felt like a door being opened that he hadn't decided yet whether to walk through. "I don't know that either," he said. "All right." Ron was quiet for a moment. "'Cause not knowing and not wanting are different things, and I've been trying to figure out which one you've got, because of how I handle it." Ron's face was calm, freckled in the thin winter sunlight, his blue eyes doing the thing they did when he was being more honest than he was letting on. There was no accusation in it, no cruelty. Just a person asking for information he actually needed in the adult register they were both still occasionally surprised to find themselves using. "I can't answer that," Harry said. "Fair enough," he said, and that was all, and they sat there for another few minutes, and then they went inside. The house, when they reached it, sat at the edge of a stretch of moorland, like something that had always been there, tall and crooked, with a weather vane that turned regardless of the wind, and a garden that had achieved a kind of aggressive wildness. Luna's father answered the door. He wore the Deathly Hallows symbol on a chain around his neck, the same triangle circle line that Harry had seen on Ignotus Peverell's grave, and on the ledger's cover, and drawn in Dumbledore's own hand, in the margin of the Beadle the Bard. The house was quiet in the way houses were quiet when someone who usually lived there was absent. Harry noticed it, and felt the shape of it, and said nothing. Luna's father made tea and talked. He talked about the sign with the genuine enthusiasm of a person who had been waiting to explain it. To someone who didn't already know, the Deathly Hallows. 3 objects, he said, made by death for 3 brothers who had outsmarted him. The Elder Wand, oldest and most powerful, which had belonged to the eldest brother. The Resurrection Stone, which could recall the dead, which had belonged to the second. The Cloak of Invisibility, which could hide the wearer from death itself, which had belonged to the youngest. The symbol he wore was the union of all 3. The line is the wand, he said, tracing the symbol in the air with a finger. The circle is the stone. The triangle is the cloak. Harry felt Hermione go still beside him. He kept his face arranged. Across the table, Luna's father was reaching for a book. Hermione's hand moved beneath the table and found Harry's forearm and pressed once, briefly. Not the seal, just the ordinary communication of a person who needed someone else to know something without saying it aloud. When Luna's father turned to find the relevant passage, she turned to Harry and said, very quietly, "The symbol on the ledger. It's not just the Peverell family mark. I know. Harry, it binds hallow bearers." She said it in the quick way of someone constructing a thought faster than she had expected to. Ignotus had the cloak, Antioch had the Elder Wand. The ledger uses the same symbol as the Hallows because it was made for those 2 specific lines. Not just anyone descended from the brothers, but the heirs of the two hallow-bearers. "The cloak is yours." She paused. "Someone designed this to unite two of the three hallow bloodlines. As a counterweight, maybe, to the danger of one person holding all three." Harry thought about what it meant to possess all three hallows. About what that possibility had already set in motion, the things people had died for in pursuit of it. Before he could answer, the front door came off its hinges. The next several minutes were the compressed, formless kind. The Death Eaters came in fast, and the three of them moved, and there was a struggle in the narrow corridor between the sitting room and the door, and they were close to getting out. Ron was out, Harry was out, Hermione was one step behind, and then a curse came from the left at close range, aimed at her, and Harry stepped in front of it without thinking. Without calculating, without anything resembling a decision, the seal flared. It was not like the small warmth that had been present since December, not the passive low-level awareness he had stopped noticing. It was gold-white and external and visible, a pulse that expanded from somewhere in the center of his chest. At the same moment, a pulse came from Hermione's, the two of them meeting and joining and throwing the curse sideways in a wash of light. Both of them went back. Harry hit the doorframe and Hermione hit the wall, and neither of them was injured. The Death Eaters stopped. Prey. In the half-second of their hesitation, Ron grabbed Harry's arm, Harry grabbed Hermione's, and the world came apart in the usual way and reassembled in open countryside 3 miles from anywhere. They lay on the grass in the grey afternoon and breathed. Ron sat up first. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione. He looked at the place where the light had been, which was now simply the space between them. "What was that?" he said. "It was not quite a question. I don't know," Harry said. "You threw yourself in front of that curse." "Yes." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Not because of the seal." Harry looked at him. "I don't know anymore where the seal ends and I begin." Ron held his gaze. His expression was the careful expression of someone doing arithmetic on something that mattered. He looked at Hermione, who had said nothing throughout this exchange, and was looking at her own hands. Then he looked back at Harry and nodded, once slightly, and turned to survey the landscape as though he were checking for company. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to the acknowledgement of a fact. That evening, Hermione found the section in the ledger she had been looking for since February. She read it twice before she said anything, and when she spoke, her voice was careful in the way it got when she was telling them something that had already happened, and she was only now finding the record of it. The seal, once it passed the 60-day threshold, generated what the archaic text called mutual shield warding, a passive protective resonance between the two bound parties. It was not powerful enough to stop an unforgivable directly. It could not absorb a killing curse, but against lesser hexes, against curses below that threshold, it softened the impact, deflected the trajectory, and sent a warning pulse to the other party in the instant before the harm arrived. "Since the 22nd of February, she said. "We've been shielding each other," Harry said, "without knowing." "Without knowing," she confirmed. "Every time you've been near a curse since then, every time I have." The seal has been running in the background. She closed the ledger. That's what the flare was. It did what it was designed to do. Harry thought about all the weeks since February, the moments he had felt suddenly alert without knowing why. The sense of wrongness a half-second before something came at him. He had attributed it to instinct, to the particular hypervigilance of living the way they were living. He looked at Hermione. She looked back. "Right," Ron said from across the tent, not looking up from the map he was studying. "So, we've got magic armor. That's something." No one argued with this assessment, and after a while they went to bed. They were taken between 1 second and the next. One moment Harry was standing in an empty lane with the dusk coming down, and the next there were snatches, 3 of them, then 5, the disillusionment charms broken before anyone could react, and the world became noise and struggling and the particular horror of a wand not in his hand. He fought. Ron fought. It didn't matter. They were bound and hooded, and he heard Hermione make a sound he never wanted to hear again before the sound cut off. And then they were dragged through a series of apparitions, and then a door opened in a cold marble hallway, and the hood came off. Malfoy Manor. He knew it from the feel of the place before his eyes had adjusted, the cold, the dark grandeur of it, the quality of the silence of a house in which very bad things had been done and would be done again. He saw Hermione for 1 second. She was being pulled toward the staircase, her arms held, and her eyes found his over the shoulder of the person holding her. Then they were separated. They threw him and Ron down a staircase. The cellar smelled of earth and damp and something old that had nothing to do with either. There were others already there, dim shapes in the darkness, but Harry was not thinking about who they were, because the seal was screaming. Not in pain, in direction. The pull he had known since the end of December, the compass needle orientation, had become a cable now, thick and taut, drawing upward from somewhere beneath his sternum, toward the floor above his head. She was up there. That was where she was. He could feel the precise location of her, the way he could feel his own heartbeat, and he stood with both hands against the stone ceiling of the cellar, and could not do a single thing. Ron was beside him. "Harry! Harry! Talk to me!" Harry pressed his forehead to the stone and breathed. Above him, through the floor, through the stone, through whatever walls and rooms separated them, he could feel Hermione. And then something broke open. It came in waves. The first one knocked the air out of him, and he made a sound that was not quite a shout, and not quite a scream, and Ron grabbed his arms. "What's happening? She's in pain." Harry heard his own voice from a long distance away, flat and compressed between locked teeth. "I can feel it. She's—" The second wave hit, and he went down. Ron caught him. Both arms against the wall, Ron's weight braced against Harry's, and Harry gripped Ron's jacket with both fists and held on while the pain came in and went and came back again. Not as severe as it was for her. He understood this, in the part of him that could still form coherent thought. The seal was attenuating it, some fraction of what she was experiencing, transferred to him through whatever mechanism the ancient magic used. But the fraction was enough to turn his vision grey at the edges and make his knees stop working. Bellatrix's voice came through the floor, distorted and wrong with distance, but recognizable. That high, delighted register she used when she was enjoying herself. Each time Harry heard it, another wave came. Ron held him upright. That was what he did. He planted himself against the wall and held Harry in both arms and did not let him go down to the floor, and when Harry's head fell against his shoulder, Ron put a hand at the back of his neck and kept him there. He was saying something, quiet and repetitive. The specific kind of thing people say when they don't know what to say and have decided that the sound is what matters. Harry stopped being able to distinguish the words. After a while, it might have been minutes, might have been a very long time, the waves became intermittent, and then spaced out, and then they stopped. The silence after them had a physical weight. Ron held on anyway. He had been watching Harry and Hermione for months. The tracking, the mutual awareness, the seal, inserting itself into their days, quiet and constant as weather. He had been trying to figure out which of the several things he felt about it was the one he intended to act on. He had not arrived at an answer that satisfied him. This was not a question of answers. Harry was pressed against his shoulder in a cold cellar, and suffering because Hermione was suffering. and there was no thought in Ron's head, no hesitation, no complicated arithmetic. He just held on. He thought, I am not going to let him go to the floor. He thought, I am going to be the person who is here. He had already left once in the autumn, under the weight of something that had told him he was second best, third chosen less than. He knew what that version of himself felt like from the inside, and it wasn't who he was. He thought, this is who I am, and held on. When it was over, when the waves had stopped entirely and Harry's weight was his own again, Ron said quietly, she stopped. I know, Harry said. Harry pulled back and looked at him. In the dim light his face was grey, and his eyes were too bright, and he had the expression of someone who had been somewhere very dark and was not yet sure he was back. He said, it doesn't matter what I think I feel or don't feel anymore. I need to get up there. I know, Ron said. Then the house elf appeared in the corner of the cellar, and everything moved. The escape was fast and desperate and nearly right. The house elf coming to them in the dark, the hushed urgency of it, taking hands, the compression of apparition, the salt smell of open air replacing stone and damp. They came apart on a wide lawn, sloping toward the sea. The night was clear. Harry had a grip on Hermione's arm and Ron's shoulder, and Hermione was breathing, standing, breathing upright under her own weight, and he felt the cable in his chest go slack. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. The knife came from behind them. It struck the house elf in the chest, thrown hard and precise from the direction of the manor, from a figure who had apparated to the lawn's edge in the moment of their arrival. Harry was beside the house elf before the elf had reached the ground. He crouched in the wet grass and caught the small body in both arms, and the house elf looked up at him with wide, fading eyes and said that it was free, that it was happy, and then it was gone. Harry knelt on the cold grass for a long time. Bill Weasley opened the door of Shell Cottage when they knocked, and if he was surprised by the number or the state of them, it showed only for a second before he stepped back and said, "Come in, all of you," in the voice of a person who has handled things that were worse than this. He was tall, red-haired, scarred along one side of his jaw and cheek, in the particular way of someone who had survived something that had wanted to change what he was, the scars pale and regular in the lamplight, marks he wore without apology. He looked at Harry and at Hermione, and something moved through his expression that was recognizing rather than asking. His wife moved among them with healing spells, quiet and efficient, her hands sure, and her French accented instructions brief. She saw to Hermione first. Harry watched from the corner of the room, the seal confirming quietly that Hermione was beside him and becoming more all right. Bill dug a grave in the garden. They buried the house elf near the sea, and Harry did not say the right words because he did not know what the right words were, only that they needed to be said. Later, much later, when the cottage was quiet and the others were sleeping, Harry went out to the cliff edge. He sat in the dark with the sea below him and the cold spring air off the water, and thought about a small pair of eyes going dim. He heard her footsteps behind him. She sat down beside him on the cliff edge, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and for a while she didn't speak, and the sea went on moving below them, and neither of them needed to fill the silence to be in it together. "You felt all of it," she said finally. "Yes." She was quiet. He waited. "I knew you were still alive," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "While she was, I could feel you. Not clearly, not like a voice, just a presence. Below me. Still there." She stopped. "Every time it got worse, I kept finding it again, that you hadn't stopped. The stars were out over the channel, and somewhere behind them the house elf was in the earth. He thought about what she had just said, and what he had felt in the cellar. The decision to name it seemed simultaneously very small and very significant. He didn't make it. But he thought, there's a word for this, and I've been not saying it, and I'm not sure how much longer that's true. Beside him, Hermione said nothing. She leaned slightly, and he leaned back, and they sat on the cliff edge in the dark with the channel below them, and the sound of the sea doing the same thing it had always done, indifferent to all of it, and therefore somehow a comfort. Bill noticed it on the second day. He had been a Gringotts curse-breaker for 6 years, and he knew what old magic looked like when it was active. Not the showy kind, not the kind that crackled and threw light, but the kind that simply held invisible and absolute the way the foundations of a building held. He had learned to feel it rather than see it, which was the skill that had kept him alive in Egyptian burial chambers and had nothing to do with being clever, and everything to do with learning to pay attention to the texture of the air in a room. Harry and Hermione had a texture. It was faint, almost nothing, but it was present, a warmth that existed between them at close range, not attached to either of them individually, but to the space they occupied together. He noticed it first when they were sitting at the kitchen table in silence, Harry staring into his tea, Hermione with her hands folded, both of them somewhere that wasn't the room. He felt the warm current of it, passed his hand through it briefly, and then went to find Hermione, alone in the garden. "What is that?" he said, without preamble, because they were past the point where gentleness served anyone better than directness. She told him about the ledger. She showed it to him at the kitchen table, while the others were occupied elsewhere, opening it to the passages she had already translated and the ones still resisting her. He read what he could. The script was old, older than the standard forms he'd encountered in the vaults, and his archaic Latin wasn't strong enough for some of the abbreviated rune forms she had worked through. He turned the cover over once in his hands and felt the specific density of it, the resistance of old binding magic that had settled into itself across centuries. "Pre-statute of secrecy," he said. The Peverells predate the statute by at least 2 centuries, probably more. Bill sat back and looked at the ledger with the expression of someone recalibrating their sense of what they were dealing with. The statute of wizarding secrecy had been enacted in 1692, and most of what he had worked with as a curse-breaker dated from within a century of it on either side. Something older than that was not just older. It operated according to entirely different principles, principles that the modern magical world had largely stopped being able to read. "This is serious ward work," he said. "The kind of binding that was built to last beyond the people who made it, and beyond the people it was made for." He looked at her. "What does the mechanism section say?" she told him. "All of it." Harry heard it from the other end of the table that evening, sitting between Ron and a silence that had the quality of something being built. Hermione had translated the warning section through the afternoon, working slowly, checking each phrase twice, and she read it out as if she were reading a set of instructions she had not written and could not revise. If one sealed party died while the seal held, the survivor would not die. The binding was not symmetrical in that way. It did not take both lives if one was lost, but the mutual shield warding would dissolve. The protective resonance would end, and because the seal had, over months, become integrated into the survivor's magical signature, its sudden absence would create a vulnerability, a gap in the architecture of the survivor's defenses, exactly the size and shape of what had been removed. The survivor would be more exposed to magical harm than they had been before the seal was active. The room was very quiet. And the survivor, Hermione said, closing the ledger, would feel the exact moment of death. Not as a fraction, directly and completely. Harry looked at the table. He said, "If I die for the Horcrux, for what the prophecy says has to happen, what does that mean for Hermione?" In that moment, Hermione said, "I won't die, but I'll know. And I'll be exposed." The shape of what the prophecy required had been with Harry since 5th year. He had to be the one to kill Voldemort, and he had gradually come to understand that this required him to first be killed himself, to walk into death deliberately, to surrender to it, so that the piece of Voldemort's soul inside him could be destroyed. He had arrived at this understanding slowly, and had not told anyone. He had not told anyone because the telling of it would have made it more real than he knew how to manage, and because the people around him had enough weight already, and because it was his, and he needed it to be his until the moment when it was simply done. He said, "So the plan has to include a way back." He did not say for Hermione. He did not need to. Ron said, "Then we figure it out. We find a way to break the seal before you do what you have to do. You can't break it without—" "Then we don't break it." Ron's voice was level and exact. He looked at Harry with the steady seriousness that had replaced, over months, the easier register they'd spoken in as children. Harry looked at him. "You came back from every single thing they've done to you," Ron said. "The chamber, the graveyard, the ministry, Malfoy Manor. You came back from every one." It was the most direct, unambiguous thing Ron had said in months. Not because it was simple. They both understood what coming back from death required, and they both understood that it was not guaranteed, and they both understood that the mechanism for it was not yet clear. But Ron said it anyway, because the alternative was to concede in advance. And Ron was not the kind of person who conceded in advance when Harry was involved. Harry said, "I'll try." Later, when Harry was outside and the cottage was winding down toward night, Hermione found Ron at the kitchen table. He was sitting with both hands around a mug, looking at something in the middle distance that was not quite the wall. She sat down across from him and didn't say anything, because she had known him for 7 years and understood that there were conversations that needed to start from silence. He said after a while, "I wanted it to be me for a while. I know, I think I knew before I knew it was Harry, that it was never going to be me." He said it without self-pity, with the tone of someone making an accurate statement about a fact they had had time to examine and arrive at the truth of. That, the way I felt, or thought I felt, was something I was putting somewhere because I didn't know what else to do with it, and it wasn't actually there. She didn't say that it was fine, or that it didn't matter, or any of the other true but insufficient things. She said, "You're my best friend. That's not less." "I know," Ron said. He looked at her then, and she could see that he did know, genuinely, without qualification. "I just needed to say it to someone who already understood the whole thing. I didn't want to be carrying it by myself anymore." "You're not," she said. He nodded and picked up his mug, and that was all. The Gringotts plan came together the following morning, around the kitchen table, with a map of Diagon Alley and a borrowed copy of Gringotts' layout that Bill had in his professional notes. It was not a good plan in the sense that it had several components that relied on things going correctly, and the war had repeatedly demonstrated that things would not go correctly. But it was the plan they had, and the cup was in Bellatrix's vault, and without the cup the Horcrux hunt stalled. Hermione would use Polyjuice Potion to take Bellatrix's appearance. They had the necessary material from Malfoy Manor. Harry would use the invisibility cloak. He thought about that as they planned. His ancestor's Hallow, the third brother's legacy, the thing Ignotus had asked death for, and passed down through generations of Potters, to end up in a vault at Hogwarts, and then in a pocket at his hip. He would carry it into the vault of a family that had murdered its way toward everything the three brothers had stood for and against, and he would use it to take back something used to make Voldemort immortal. He would go in invisible to retrieve what would help make possible the death that would end this. He did not say any of this aloud because it was the kind of observation. He wrote it into the plan and folded the map and passed it to Bill and said, "When can we move?" Bill said, "Give it a week. Let Hermione recover." She started to object. Harry looked at her, and she looked back, and the seal did the thing it did, and she closed her mouth and said, "Fine, a week." Ron looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person deciding not to comment. He had, Harry thought, earned that expression entirely. The face in the mirror was not hers. Hermione had used Polyjuice Potion before, but this was different. The face, looking back at her, in the Shell Cottage bathroom, was Bellatrix Lestrange's, gaunt-cheeked, heavy-lidded, with the particular darkness of a woman who had spent 14 years in Azkaban and come out of it more committed to the dark, not less. She wore it correctly, carefully, with a constant awareness that it would expire. She adjusted her expression until it was blank rather than queasy, and went downstairs to find Harry. She could not see him in the front room. She could feel him, 2 feet to her left, angled toward the door, the seal giving her a directional warmth as precise and reliable as a compass heading. In the 4 months since December, it had become so integrated into how she moved through a day that she sometimes forgot it was there. Now, going into a vault in disguise with security measures designed to detect imposters, the quiet pulse of it at the center of her chest was the most reassuring thing in the room. She felt him move to stand beside her. "Ready?" he said, from roughly where she expected his shoulder to be. "No," she said. "Let's go." The Gringotts lobby was cold marble and arched ceilings and goblins who looked at her with the specific, evaluating wariness of professionals who had spent their careers detecting exactly what she was. She walked through it the way she imagined Bellatrix walked through things, as though the building were grateful for her presence and kept the seal's warmth to her left like a handrail in the dark. The vault levels beneath the bank were older than most of what she had studied. The carts descended through rock carved, long before the statute of wizarding secrecy had made discretion a requirement. Through a darkness that felt inhabited, she kept her breathing regular. The seal pulsed warmth. At her left shoulder, Harry, 3 feet away, 5 feet close again. And she focused on that, and on what she needed to do, and on the fact that they were still moving. The cave-in was sudden, a section of passage sealed without warning. The vault's defenses triggered all at once, and the darkness became absolute. She had her wand out before she could think. Lumos. The light carved a small sphere of visibility around her and showed her nothing but rock and the narrow cart track. The seal screamed, not in pain. The distinction she had learned to make. It was the direction pull the same compass needle insistence she had first felt on the frozen night outside the tent in December, but magnified past anything she had experienced. It was pulling toward the sealed-off section with the force of a current she had to physically brace against. She gripped the cart rail and set her feet and breathed and thought, "He's alive. I can feel that he's alive. The thread is intact." Seconds. She counted them. The seal's pull was not what changed. What changed was that a light appeared around the edge of the sealed section. Not warm, not the quality of warmth. Harry's Lumos, cold and white. And then he was there, through the narrow gap that a severing charm had opened, one hand braced on the rock, the cloak thrown back from his face. He said nothing. His hand came out and found her arm, just above the elbow, and he held it for 3 seconds. She felt his grip through the layers of Bellatrix's coat and her own skin and whatever the seal made of distance, and she did not say anything either. Then he released her and pulled the cloak back up, and she turned toward the vault. The cup was smaller than she expected. It sat among a vast pile of multiplying treasures. All the security magic of the vault was designed to make removal impossible, every object multiplying at a touch, burning at a touch. And she had to move fast, and she had to move right. The basilisk fang was cold in her hand, dense with the particular magical weight of something that had already ended one Horcrux. She felt the cup's magic even before she touched it. A repulsion, the deep wrongness of something that should not exist, something that had been made into a container for a piece of a fractured soul. She brought the fang down. The sound was enormous. The cup's destruction sent a shockwave through the vault that knocked several of them back, and with it came something she had not expected. The seal pulsed, once hard, like a heartbeat struck by a bell. Not painful, but unmistakable. She found Harry's invisible arm in the chaos of multiplying objects and held on, and she thought, and it was not something she had time to reason through. It was just a thing that came, that the Cadmus line ended here. Cadmus Peverell, to the Gaunt family, to Voldemort, to the cup, and the cup to ash and ringing air. And she was the heir of the other brother, the eldest, the most violent, and she had ended what the youngest's line had made into something monstrous. She told herself she could think about the symmetry of it later. Right now she needed to run. The dragon was not part of the plan. The plan had stopped being the plan when the goblins raised the full alarm. What they had instead was a very large Ukrainian iron belly, chained deep beneath the bank, evidently waiting for exactly this. Harry released its chains. It moved. She climbed because the alternative was being left behind, and held on because the alternative was falling, and at some point she realized she was herself again. The polyjuice worn off, her own hair, her own hands on the scales. Below them, London opened out. The dragon understood only that the air was open, and it was free. They crashed into it at speed. The cold was absolute. Taz. She came up, gasping, the lake surface around her bright and disorienting, and then Harry came up beside her, very close, both of them treading water, and his hands found her in the water, not quite the way they would have if he were pulling her to safety, not the grip of a rescue. He just held on. She held back. The water was cold and the sun was coming through the clouds above them, and she could hear Ron somewhere behind her sputtering and alive, and Harry's face was very close, and he was laughing, slightly wildly, the way people laughed when they had been in a very small space with death for a very long time and found themselves outside it. She laughed, too. She couldn't help it. She was herself again and wet, and the seal was warm in her chest, and Ron was shouting something from 5 feet away that was either outrage or joy, and Harry was looking at her with his wet hair flat over his forehead, and his green eyes bright, and she thought, we're alive, we're still alive, we did it. They swam to shore. Ron arrived with his arms up, declaring the plan had only mostly failed, which he considered a victory. They dried off beside a fire in a field, 2 miles from anything, and Ron said, without particular drama, "We need to go to Hogwarts." They all knew it. The diadem was in the room of requirement, and Hogwarts was where the war was gathering toward its end. Harry said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the fire with the expression he got when he was thinking about something that had a specific shape he hadn't said out loud yet. Hermione watched it and thought, he knows something about what comes next that he hasn't told us. She filed it and said, "Tomorrow then." That night, unable to sleep, she opened the ledger. She had been working toward the final section for weeks, the deepest archaic passage, compressed into a register of Latin, so old her best resources only partially covered it. She had been delaying it, she thought, because whatever the final passage said, it would determine what all of this meant. She read it 3 times before she believed she had it right. The seal endures through death itself, for it is not of the blood, but of the choosing. When the bound pair choose freely, the seal transforms from binding to blessing, and what was named before they could know shall become what they knew before they could name. She sat with it in the firelight for a long time. Endures through death itself, not diminished by it, not dissolved by it. She thought about Harry's face at the fire, the thing behind his eyes he hadn't told anyone. She thought about what endures through death meant in the context of a seal that was not of the blood, but of the choosing, and what that implied about the path she had seen clearly since February, the one she hadn't been able to say aloud to Harry because she did not yet have the language for it. She had the language for it. Now she closed the ledger. Harry was asleep 6 feet away. Hogwarts was a day away. She would tell him when the moment was right. Not tonight. She kept the passage to herself and let the fire burn, and waited. Hogsmeade was dark and wrong. The village had been quiet under the weight of the regime. Shuttered shops, no lights, the kind of stillness that was not peaceful, but held, like a breath being kept back. Harry felt it, as they moved through it in the dark, and felt also the seal's steady warmth beside him, Hermione 2 feet to his right, and thought, they were almost at the end of something. The barkeeper at the Hogshead opened the door before they knocked. He looked at Harry once, long and measuring, with eyes that had seen too much, and arrived on the other side of it, without becoming smaller. He said nothing except to point them toward the back, where behind an old portrait a passage opened that smelled of stone and age. They climbed in. The passage came out in the room of requirement. Neville Longbottom was there. He was not the Neville Harry had last seen at Hogwarts. The soft-faced boy had become someone broader, more certain, with the look of a person who had been tested repeatedly and had not broken. He saw Harry and crossed the room in 5 strides, and the way he moved said more than anything he might have said about what the last year had been for the people who had stayed. The castle was assembling itself. Faces came through. Order members, students, teachers. Harry had known since he was 11, now standing in corridors with their wands out. Harry moved through it and let it settle into him, because there would be time to feel it later, or there would not. He saw Ginny across the great hall. She saw him at the same moment. Her red hair was shorter than it had been, her brown eyes carrying the careful steadiness of someone who had spent a year learning not to show their hand. She crossed the distance between them at a controlled walk that, halfway across the room, became a run, and then she was there, and his arms went around her, and he held on. She was real. She had always been real. The warmth of her, the particular sharpness of her that had been the promise of something ordinary on the other side of all this. He had loved her, and the feeling had not disappeared. He held her, and he meant it, and nothing about the moment was false, and across the great hall with the precision of a compass needle, he felt exactly where Hermione was standing. He knew without turning. He knew the distance and the direction against the far wall, watching, not looking away. The two things coexisted, real, and the difference between them was not a difference of feeling, but of kind. What he felt for Ginny was love. What he felt when the seal pointed him at the far wall was something that had stopped having a separate name. He pulled back. He looked at Ginny's face. "Stay safe," he said. He could not tell her anything else. Not here, not now, not when Hogwarts was about to become a battlefield, and he was already running through what had to happen in what order. Her face as he stepped away was something he would carry for the rest of his life, however long that was, and he knew it, and he moved. Anyway. The room of requirement was different the third time he entered it. It had become the Fiendfire room, the version that the castle had chosen in response to the emergency of a Horcrux hidden inside it, and what Harry felt when he crossed the threshold was the particular pressure of old dark magic that knew it was being looked for. The diadem was in there somewhere, Rowena Ravenclaw's lost diadem, turned into a container for a piece of Voldemort's soul, and hidden in the accumulated wreckage of centuries. He found it faster than he expected, which meant something was going wrong somewhere. The Fiendfire started in the far section of the room. A Slytherin student, whose name Harry did not know, younger than him, panicked. The fire already passed the point of control before anyone fully understood what it was. And then the fire was moving, and the shapes it took. It moved with intent. It moved with hunger. He ran. He passed Draco Malfoy, which was not something he had expected, and had a half-second of considering and resolved it immediately. He pulled Malfoy onto the nearest broom, and they flew toward a door, and the diadem was in his hand, and behind them, Draco Malfoy's pale face, as they tumbled into the corridor, was not triumphant and not grateful. It was the face of a person who was reassessing everything they had been told about who their enemies were. Harry didn't have time to speak to it. The diadem died as they left the room. 5 Horcruxes, the snake, and Harry himself. The battle was in full force by the time they reached the main corridors. The castle had become a war. Everywhere Harry looked, there were people fighting. Teachers, students, Order members, Death Eaters, the castle's own magic responding to the battle in strange, wild ways, staircases shifting with purposeful chaos, portraits running between frames to carry information. He ran through it. Beside him, Hermione was running too, and he felt the seal like a thread between them, taut and warm and absolutely present. Remus Lupin was fighting near the entrance hall, and Harry passed him without stopping. Molly Weasley was at the far end of the same corridor with the particular terrifying calm Harry associated with her most formidable moods. Neville was on the staircase above, holding the landing with the sword of Gryffindor. Hagrid's voice was audible from outside, vast above everything else. Harry ran. The explosion came from the direction of the corridor outside the trophy room. He was already moving toward it, some instinct, some wrongness in the sound of it, when he heard Ron shout. It was a sound he had never heard from Ron before. It had no words in it. Fred was on the floor. He had been laughing, someone said afterward, in the second before the wall came down. Harry didn't know if this was true or if it was the kind of thing people said to make death bearable, but it fit, and he chose to believe it, because Fred had been that way, had found the moment of levity in the most dire situation, had made the darkness less absolute. He was 20 years old, and he was on the floor, and the wall had come down, and there was dust still falling. Ron dropped to his knees. The world around him was still going. The battle continued, somewhere behind them, stones still rattling, spells still sounding, and Ron was on his knees beside his brother, and the noise of it simply stopped for him. Harry watched it happen in real time, the moment the world reduced to one terrible fact. Across the room he could see George. George had seen it too. Hermione was beside Ron before Harry had fully processed that she had moved. She sank down next to him and put her arms around him from behind, not speaking, not trying to speak, and Ron's hands came up and gripped her arms and held on. She rested her forehead against the back of his shoulder, and they knelt there together in the dust and the diminishing noise. Harry stood above them. He put his hand on Ron's shoulder. He held it there for 1 second. He looked at Fred and at George's face across the room and at Hermione's closed eyes against Ron's shoulder, and he thought, I know what this is. I have known from the beginning that it was going to cost everything. He said, I know. I'm sorry. I have to go. Ron's grip on Hermione's arms did not loosen. He did not look up. Harry took his hand back. He found a corner of corridor, 3 turnings away, where the battle had not yet reached, and he sat on the floor with his back against the cold stone, and he took the first snitch out of his pocket. He had carried it through every month of the hunt, and had not opened it because he had not been at the close, not until now. The snitch sat in his palm, gold and small, warm from his body heat, and he breathed, and he thought about what he was about to do and what it would cost. He thought about the seal. He thought about Hermione in the corridor, outside the great hall, about what she had said on the cliff at Shell Cottage. I knew you were still alive. While she was, I knew you hadn't stopped asterisk. He thought about what she would know, the moment he stopped. He thought about the last passage of the ledger which Hermione had not yet told him she had found. And then, not as peace, but as the thing just past despair, he believed it. He believed the seal endured through death itself, not because he had proof. Because Hermione had been building toward something for weeks, and she did not build toward things that were not true. He pressed his lips to the snitch. Asterisk, I open at the close. Asterisk, the shell split, and the resurrection stone lay in his hand, and the forbidden forest waited. The battle had paused. Voldemort had called a ceasefire, an hour, he said, to collect their dead, and the words carried the particular cruelty of a person who believed they had already won. The fighting had stopped, in the sudden way of things that have been interrupted rather than concluded, and the castle was breathing, and Harry had perhaps 15 minutes before he had to be in the Forbidden Forest. He found Hermione in the corridor outside the great hall. She was sitting on the floor against the wall, her knees drawn up, her wand in her hand, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and there was something in her face that said she already knew, not the content, not yet, but the shape of it. She had been doing what she always did when she was waiting for something she dreaded, reading herself, cataloguing her own capacity for it, arriving in advance at the place she needed to be. He sat down beside her on the cold stone. There were sounds from inside the hall. Quiet sounds, the kind made when people are trying not to make sound, and the corridor was otherwise empty. He said, I'm the 7th Horcrux. He had not said it aloud before. He had thought it, turned it over, arrived at it from every available angle, and had never said it, because the saying would make it the kind of truth that required immediate action. He told her, all of it, what the pensieve had shown him, what the prophecy required, what it meant that a piece of Voldemort's soul had been living behind his scar since Godric's Hollow, that the piece had to be destroyed, that Voldemort had to be the one to do it, that there was one way and he had known it for months, and it required him to walk into the Forbidden Forest and stand without defending himself. He stopped. You might survive it, Hermione said. Her voice was careful, the careful of someone who had been working through a problem from every side and had arrived at the edge of what they could see. The prophecy says, neither can live while the other survives. It doesn't specify the mechanism. I know, Harry said. I don't know if that's enough. The corridor was very quiet. She was steady. He could feel her distress in the seal, a deep wrenching below the warmth, but she was holding it, making the decision in real time, and the decision was visible. She said, I need to tell you something first. She reached into her bag and took out the ledger. She had not opened it in days, but she knew the page. She turned to it without looking, the way she turned to things she had read enough times to have memorized the exact location of the text on the leaf. She translated it aloud into the corridor, her voice level, each word placed with the precision of someone for whom language was not decorative but structural. And the ancient words became English. When the bound pair choose freely, the seal transforms from binding to blessing, and what was named before they could know shall become what they knew before they could name. Asterisk, a silence. Endures through death. She was looking at him. There were tears on her face. Not many running quietly with the particular quality of tears, from someone who is not giving in to them, but cannot prevent them entirely. I found it after Gringotts. I didn't tell you right away because I needed to be certain, and because the moment needed to be, I needed it to be the right moment. This is the right moment, Harry said. Yes, she said. She put the ledger down. She looked at him with the expression he had been learning to read all year, the one that was not the expression she wore for everyone, the direct one, the one that did not manage or measure, and she said, Harry, I choose you. It was not a declaration. It was more precise than that. It was a legal statement and a magical statement and an old statement addressed to the ancient binding in the ledger's pages, and to him simultaneously as the oldest forms of contract required, both parties willing. The simplest sentence, everything it needed to be. The seal pulsed once, warm, and then settled into something Harry could only describe afterward as changed. Not stronger, not louder, but different in kind. As though what had been a question was now an answer. He said, I know. I chose you too. I just didn't have words for it until tonight. She closed her eyes for one moment. When she opened them, he was very close, and he put his hand against her face. One hand, his thumb just below her cheekbone, in the way you touched something you were about to leave. Not a farewell and not a promise. Her hand came up and covered his. She said, Come back. He said, I'll try. He took his hand back. He reached into his pocket and took out the first snitch. He pressed it to his lips. The shell split. The resurrection stone fell into his palm, Cadmus's hallow, the second brother's wish, cold and small and carved with the deathly hallow symbol. The same symbol as the ledger, the same symbol as Ignotus Peverell's gravestone, the emblem of all three brothers united. He closed his hand around it and stood up, and he did not look back, because if he looked back, he would not be able to go. The forbidden forest was dark. He walked into it, the way he had walked into every terrible thing, one foot in front of the other, no running, no calculation, simply moving, because stopping was not an option. He turned the stone 3 times in his hand. His father had untidy dark hair and the same build Harry saw in his own mirror. His mother had her red hair and the green eyes. He had spent his life being told were hers, both of them dead at 21, gone for nearly 17 years, and here, now in the dark of the forest, with expressions that broke him open in the way only they could. They did not speak first. They walked beside him, shadows on his left and right, their presence a warmth that was older than the seals. His mother said, We're so proud of you. He could not answer. He walked. He found the clearing. Voldemort was there, and the Death Eaters ranked behind him, and Harry walked into the space between the trees and stopped. He let his wand fall to his side. He thought of Hermione in the corridor with her hand over his. He thought of his parents walking at his shoulder. He thought, asterisk, I chose. I was not compelled. I chose, asterisk. Voldemort raised his wand. The curse was green and absolute. In the great hall, 3 corridors and a staircase away, Hermione was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and Ron's shoulder under her cheek. She had been talking, something not important, filling time, and then she stopped talking. The seal went still. It did not go out. It did not die, did not sever, did not do the thing she had feared since February, when she had translated the warning about what happened if one sealed party was lost. It simply went still. It was the difference between a candle extinguished and a candle in a breathless room. Not gone, but held, paused between the motion of itself, the way a heartbeat felt at its lowest ebb between beats when you had convinced yourself it wasn't going to come back. She put both hands flat on the stone floor. Ron had been watching her. He grabbed her arms. "Is he—" "Not yet," she said. She was very calm. The calmness was not the absence of feeling. It was the place she arrived when feeling became too large for any expression, and she had to simply hold it in the structure of her body and wait. "I don't know. Not yet." Ron did not let go of her arms. Around them the castle was in the quiet that descends between phases of a catastrophe. People moving softly. No one running. The wounded being tended, the survivors looking toward the dark windows. Ron sat down beside her on the floor. He did not let go. He had not let go since Fred, and he was not going to let go now. It was simply what he did in every room he could have left. He stayed. The ledger was in Hermione's bag, its last passage read, its work almost done, the seal held, still as held breath, in the quiet space between what Harry had done and what came next. The ancient magic was doing exactly what it had said it would, in the register of an artifact that predated the statute of wizarding secrecy, and every institution built since, in the language of a time when promises were not legal instruments. It endured. Hermione held Ron's hand and breathed and waited, her other hand flat against the stone, and the stone was cold, and the corridor was dark, and somewhere in the forbidden forest, the oldest magic in her possession was working in the silence between heartbeats. It had to be enough. There was a place between. Harry had no other word for it. It was not dark, and it was not bright. It was the absence of the distinction, a whiteness that had nothing to do with color. And he was in it. And he was alone. There was no pain. There was no weight of a body. He was simply present in the way a thought was present, without location. The seal was there. He felt it before he felt anything else, which surprised him somehow, though he could not have said why. It was not the warmth he had known for months, not the directional pull, not the compass needle orientation. It had become something different. It was the kind of warmth that did not pull toward anything, because it had arrived at where it was going. Not a binding, not a thread. Just a constant, settled, genuine presence. Like a fire in a room you have lived in long enough to stop noticing it is warm, because warm is what the room is. He thought about Hermione in the corridor, her hand over his, and about the ledger's last passage, and what it meant that the seal endured here in the between place, unchanged by what had just happened to him. The ancient magic had named what was present and waited for them to arrive at the same conclusion by their own path. They had arrived. He had a choice, the between place, which was quiet in a way that living was not, or back, which would not be, quiet. He chose. Not because the seal compelled him, because Hermione was on a corridor floor holding Ron's hand and waiting, and he had said he would try. The whiteness changed in the corridor. Hermione felt it before she could explain what she was feeling. The stillness had been absolute for what felt like much longer than it probably was. The seal held between beats. neither present nor absent, balanced on an edge she had not been sure it could hold. And then it moved. Not the return of what it had been, not the binding warmth, not the directional pull, but something new in the same space, something that felt like the difference between a fist and an open hand. Wider, less urgent, as though it had been a door held nearly shut by a specific necessary pressure, and the pressure had now gently lifted. She lifted her head. Ron read her face the way he had learned to read it across 7 years. He said, "He's back." She said, "He's back." She pressed both palms flat to the floor and breathed and let herself feel it for exactly 1 moment before she stood. Harry lay still in the forbidden forest while Narcissa Malfoy leaned over him in the dark. She asked him barely above a whisper whether her son was alive. He told her yes. Her voice when she turned back to Voldemort was clear. He was dead. She had used the lie as currency for the only thing she wanted, and Harry lay still and thought, the war is full of people doing terrible things for ordinary reasons. He was carried back to Hogwarts against Hagrid's chest, and Hagrid wept with every step, and Harry did not move. The battle resumed. He came out of it when Neville Longbottom stood alone in the courtyard with the sorting hat in his hand. Harry had been moving through the chaos for what felt like minutes, but had probably been longer. The castle opened to the sky in places, the fighting fractured and urgent, the Death Eaters responding to Voldemort's command to fight with the specific desperation of people who had bet everything on one outcome and found it uncertain. Harry had the cloak on. He moved unseen. He watched Neville reach into the hat, and what came out of it was silver and old and unmistakable. And Neville did not hesitate, because that was what Neville was now. And then it was Harry, alone, in the ruins of the entrance hall. Voldemort came at him with the Elder Wand, Antioch Peverell's Hallow, the one the eldest brother had demanded, the weapon that had passed through centuries of death and desire and arrived here in the hand of Cadmus's heir. Harry had the Holly Wand repaired. Whole again, he threw the only spell that had ever fully been his. Expelliarmus. He thought, in half-second of it, Antioch's wand being turned against Ignotus's heir by Cadmus's. The 3 Peverell lines converging on one point. The wand's allegiance had been Harry's since the night at Malfoy Manor when Draco was disarmed, the loyalty passing without ceremony. Antioch's own weapon would not harm the man who bore Ignotus's blood. He did not say this aloud. He thought it, briefly, and then the wand light resolved, and the killing curse came back along its own path. And Tom Riddle, who had been born on a dark night in 1926 and had made himself immortal and terrible across 7 decades, fell. The noise stopped. After Harry moved through the great hall, with the specific care of someone crossing ground they do not fully trust yet. People touched his arm, pressed his hand. He accepted all of it and kept moving, not impolitely but with purpose, the seal pointing him like a compass toward the one fixed point in the room. He found Hermione near Ron, who was sitting beside his brother George in the way you sat beside someone, when sitting beside them was the only thing that made sense. Ron looked up when Harry arrived, and something in his face did the thing it had been doing for months, accounting, accepting, landing on the version of things that was true. And then he looked away again, back to George, and Harry understood this was Ron's gift, giving them the space to be what they were. He sat down beside Hermione. He did not speak. He found her hand at her side, and she turned it over without looking, and he took it, and she held his in return, and that was all. The seal was warm, but it was different from every version of warmth he had felt from it since Christmas Eve. It was not proprietary. It was not urgent. It did not pull. It simply existed as Warmth simply existed in a place that had been warm long enough to stop being remarkable. It was the warmth of something that had completed what it was. He sat there and breathed and did not do anything else. For a long time, morning came slowly, the way mornings came after nights that had been too long. Hermione opened the ledger for the last time, when the first light was coming through the windows that still had glass. Harry was asleep against the wall beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. Ron was asleep on his other side. Around them, the hall was quiet, with the quiet of exhaustion, people resting in places they had not chosen but had arrived at, and the early light was the specific grey that preceded gold. The text had changed more completely than she had expected. Where the mechanism section had described obligation and constraint, the language had become record. Not what the parties shall do, but what the parties have done. Not binding, but acknowledgement. The words she had spent months working through, the Latin she had learned to read in a register that predated the statute of wizarding secrecy, had rearranged themselves from instruction to history. Asterisk, the parties have chosen, freely and knowingly. The compact is fulfilled. What was named before they could know has become what they knew before they could name. Asterisk, she read it twice. The same sentence she had found in the final passage, transformed from future. She turned to the cover. The Deathly Hallows symbol, the triangle circle line that had flared gold-white in the Lovegood house and pulsed at the cup's destruction and glowed on the night of Christmas Eve when everything had started, was no longer raised. It was simply a line pressed into the leather, the same shape, but the wax that had given it weight and darkness was gone. It was empty of compulsion, a record of what had been, not a directive about what must be. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, the ordinary weight of a very old book. Then she set it in her beaded bag, under everything else, under the research notes and the spare robes, and the Horcrux materials that had served their purpose, and the detritus of 9 months of living out of one bag. Harry shifted beside her, not waking, just settling the way people settled in sleep when they were finally, actually safe. She could feel the warmth of him through the seal, and through the ordinary warmth of proximity, two things that had always been the same thing and had simply taken time to learn it. She rested her head against his shoulder. The ancient magic that had named them before they could know was quiet now. It had said what it had to say in the only language old enough to say it, and they had caught up with it,